The Council ordered Earth to surrender. Humanity refused. The signal came at 6:14 in the morning, Greenwich Mean Time, and it did not knock. It did not ask permission. It did not wait for a satellite relay or a press conference or a carefully worded diplomatic opening. It simply arrived, and in doing so, it ended the world as I had known it for 36 years. My name is Ilara Voss. I am a diplomat. I speak 7 languages, 4 of which belong to species that humanity had, until 9 months ago, no idea existed. I have sat across negotiation tables from men who smiled while lying, from women who cried while meaning every word, from entire delegations whose only goal was to watch the other side blink first. I thought I had seen every version of power that the universe could produce. I was wrong. I was in my kitchen in Geneva when every screen in the building turned on by itself. Not just mine. Every screen in the building. Every screen in the city. Every television, every phone, every tablet, every digital billboard on every highway in every country on Earth flickered to the same image at the exact same moment. I know because my neighbor called me while it was happening, and I could hear his television in the background, saying the exact same words mine was saying, slightly out of sync, like an echo of something too large to contain. The image was simple, a blue-white sphere rotating slowly against a field of stars. Earth, seen from orbit, small and green and surrounded by something that was not weather. 14 ships. I counted them before the voice even began. 14 ships arranged in a wide arc beyond the moon, each one roughly 3 times the size of the largest aircraft carrier ever built, each one perfectly still in a way that no human spacecraft had ever been perfectly still. They did not drift. They did not rotate. They simply existed in space the way a boulder exists on a mountainside, certain of their place, unconcerned with the drop below. Then the voice came. It was not a frightening voice. That was the first thing that confused me. I had imagined, in the abstract way that everyone imagines things they do not truly believe will happen, that alien contact would sound strange. Mechanical, perhaps. Cold. Inhuman in some obvious, visceral way that would confirm every fear we had ever buried inside science fiction novels and late-night conversations. Instead, it was calm, patient, the kind of voice a doctor uses when delivering news that the patient already suspects but has not yet accepted. It came in perfect English first, then repeated itself in Mandarin, then Arabic, then Spanish, then French, then Hindi, then Russian, cycling through the 12 most widely spoken languages on Earth with the ease of something that had been studying us for a very long time. People of Earth, this message is delivered on behalf of the Galactic Concord, a cooperative body representing 47 sovereign civilizations. Your world has been under observation for 114 of your years. Based on that observation, the Concord has reached a formal determination. Your species has been classified as a Class 7 developmental risk. This classification is not a judgment of your worth. It is an assessment of your trajectory. You have 72 hours to acknowledge receipt of this message through any broadcast frequency. Following acknowledgement, formal terms of transition will be transmitted. Those terms will include the peaceful dissolution of your current governmental structures, the surrender of all active weapons programs, and the transfer of planetary administration to a Concord-appointed oversight body. This arrangement is designed to ensure the safety of your species and the stability of the surrounding region. The Concord has administered transitions of this nature 41 times. In each case, the result was the preservation and flourishing of the species involved. We look forward to your cooperation. Then the image was gone. Every screen went dark. And for exactly 4 seconds, I think the entire Earth was silent. Then my phone rang. Then it rang again. Then every phone I owned rang at the same time, and I could hear through the window the sound of Geneva waking up, not slowly the way a city usually wakes, but all at once, like a single enormous creature drawing a sharp breath. I stood in my kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, and I thought about those 4 seconds of silence. 4 seconds was a very long time. I had been in rooms where bad news arrived, and the silence after it lasted less than one. I had watched diplomats receive threats across polished tables and seen their faces change in fractions of a second. Silence after shock is a human reflex, and it never lasts long because humans are not built for quiet. But 4 seconds. 4 seconds told me something the aliens had not planned for. People were not reaching for their phones in panic. They were not running. They were not crying, not yet. They were thinking, processing. And in that small gap between the message and the reaction, I saw something that I do not think the Conquered, with all its observations and all its data, had properly catalogued. The people of Earth were not afraid of the message. They were insulted by it. I worked my way to the un-emergency session through streets that were loud but not chaotic. There was shouting, yes. There were people gathered in clusters around phones and storefronts, watching replays of the broadcast. There were arguments, plenty of them, the way there always are when humans are handed a problem they have not solved yet. But there was no running, no screaming, no collapse. In a small bakery I passed on the way to the transport station, a woman was selling bread like she did every morning, and the line outside was actually longer than usual. I stopped for just a moment because the sight of it struck me so completely that I almost laughed. People were buying bread. 41 civilizations had apparently surrendered to these ships, and the people of Geneva were buying bread. I filed that image away. I did not know then that I would use it later, in a council chamber on the far side of the solar system, as evidence of the most dangerous quality our species possesses. The unchamber was already full when I arrived. Every seat taken, every delegation present, screens everywhere showing the 14 ships sitting beyond the moon with the patience of something that had done this many times before. The Secretary General was at the podium, and his voice was steady, which surprised me, and I had known him for 11 years. The first 11 minutes were exactly what you would expect. Delegation after delegation rose to express alarm, to demand verification, to ask whether this was real, to suggest it might not be real, to insist that a response should or should not be sent, to argue about who had the authority to respond, and whether any response at all constituted an acknowledgement of the Conquered's authority over Earth's governance. 11 minutes, that is all the chaos lasted. Then a delegate from the South African bloc, a quiet man named Patrick Cole, who I had always found easy to underestimate, stood up and said something so simple that it cut straight through everything else. He said, "I think we all know what the answer is. We are just deciding whether we are brave enough to say it." The room went still. And from that stillness, with remarkable speed, a consensus formed. Not a unanimous one. 3 delegations abstained. 2 formally objected. But the core of it, the beating heart of the decision, was reached faster than any other significant vote I had ever witnessed at the UN, and I had witnessed 30 years of them. Earth would not comply. It would not dissolve. It would not disarm. It would not transfer authority to anyone. Now came the harder question: who would say so? The committee turned to communications. The Conquered's message had come through every frequency simultaneously, which meant any response sent through standard channels might not even reach them, or might be dismissed as unofficial. The response had to come through verified diplomatic frequency, registered and acknowledged, and the person delivering it had to be someone whose credentials the Conquered would recognize, which meant someone whose linguistic profile matched the Conquered's own diplomatic registry. I had not told many people that, during the 9 months of quiet pre-contact, a small UN team had been compiling everything we could decode from the low-frequency signals the Conquered had been sending into our solar system for decades. I was one of 4 people who had learned to speak, haltingly, but functionally, 2 of the Conquered's registered communication forms. I was the only one currently in the building. The committee chair looked at me across the chamber. I looked back. She said, Alara. I said, I know. I walked to the transmission console with my cold coffee stomach and my 36 years of knowing how to keep my face calm when everything inside was doing something else entirely. I sat down. The technician beside me confirmed the frequency was live. I thought briefly about my mother, who had once told me that the most important thing a person could do in any difficult moment was remember that the other side was also afraid of something. I had never found a negotiation where that was not true. I wondered if it was true now. Then I leaned forward and I spoke. This is Alara Voss, diplomatic representative of the United Nations of Earth, speaking on behalf of the sovereign people of this planet. Your message has been received, reviewed, and formally considered by the appropriate governing bodies of humanity. After full deliberation, Earth's response is as follows. I paused not for effect, because I needed one breath. Humanity declines. I closed the channel. The room behind me did not cheer. It did not erupt. It sat in the same quality of silence that had followed the original broadcast, that specific human silence that is not emptiness, but the sound of a decision becoming real. Then my console lit up. The Conquered was calling back. I looked at the light on the screen for a moment before I answered. And when I pressed the button, the voice on the other end was no longer the calm, patient voice of the recorded message. It was something else, something that, even through the translation filter, I recognized immediately. It was surprise. The being who appeared on my screen was not what I had expected, though by that point I had stopped expecting things in the old way. It called itself Veth Saron, and it was the Conquered's primary liaison for what it referred to, without apparent irony, as transition facilitation. I had the sense immediately that Veth Saron was very good at its job, and that its job had never once required it to do what it was now doing, which was improvise. It had 4 limbs, a long and narrow head, and eyes that sat slightly too far apart to be comfortable by human standards. Its skin, if it was skin, shifted between 2 shades of gray depending on the angle of the light. It wore something structured and dark across its upper body, and it moved with the particular economy of something that had been trained since birth to reveal nothing. But the pause before it spoke lasted 2 full seconds longer than the recorded message's cadence. That pause told me more than anything it said after it. Representative Voss, it said, through the translator that filtered its speech into English, we acknowledge your transmission. We want to confirm that the response you delivered reflects the official position of your planet's governing body. It does, I said. Another pause. We want to ensure there has been no miscommunication. The Conquered's offer extends full protected status to your species, with guaranteed preservation of your culture, your biology, and your territorial boundaries within your home system. Refusal of this offer has consequences that your civilization may not be fully equipped to assess. I noted the phrasing, may not be fully equipped, not will not. The qualifier was doing a great deal of work. We understand the offer, I said, and we understand the consequences as you've described them. Our position remains unchanged. Veth Saron looked at something off-screen for a moment. When it looked back, its expression had shifted, and I spent the next 2 hours trying to accurately name what that shift was. The closest word I found was recalculation. Representative Voss, it said, the Conquered will require 24 hours to consider how to proceed. In the interim, 3 additional vessels will enter your inner system as a precautionary measure. This is standard procedure and does not constitute hostile action. I said, we note that any vessel entering our inner system without invitation will be regarded as a violation of our sovereign space. The pause this time was the longest yet. That position is noted, it said. The screen went dark. I sat at the console for a moment after the call ended, and Patrick Cole appeared beside me and put a cup of tea on the desk without saying anything, which was exactly the right thing to do. I drank half of it before I spoke. "They didn't expect that," I said. "No," he said. "They've done this 41 times, and nobody ever said no." 41 for 41, he said, "until now." I thought about what that meant. 41 civilizations, presumably each with their own history and their own courage and their own arguments against surrender, and every single one of them had eventually decided that the ships in orbit were too large, too certain, too many, and that compliance was the only rational choice. The Concord had built its entire model on that assumption. Its fleet was a deterrent, not a weapon. Its process was theater, not war. It had never needed to do anything more than arrive. I thought about what Veth Saron had looked like in that second pause, and I thought about something my mother once said about the difference between a bluff and a threat. A threat knows what it will do if called. A bluff only knows how to hope it won't be. Then the alarm went off. The three ships had not waited 24 hours. They had entered Mars orbit within 6, and they had not come alone. The new count on the screen was not 3. It was 11. The total conquered presence in our solar system was now 25 ships, and they were arranged not in a patient arc beyond the moon, but in a hard line between Earth and the outer system, and every single one of them was pointed in the same direction. At us. I put down my tea. The Unsecurity Council convened in the lower chamber, the one built after 2040, one with the reinforced walls and the hardened communication systems that everyone had hoped would never be necessary. I was the last person through the door before it locked, and the room was already running through everything we had. What we had on paper was not impressive. Compared to 25 ships of that size, humanity's orbital capacity was a collection of research stations, communications relays, and a handful of crewed platforms that had been described publicly as climate monitoring installations. That last part was not entirely accurate. After the long-range signal anomalies of 2039, when the first clear evidence emerged that the low-frequency pulses reaching our solar system were not natural, a quiet conversation had started in certain rooms that most people never entered. Not a panic, not a war preparation. A conversation, the kind that careful people have when they notice something on the horizon that they cannot yet name but can feel moving toward them. The result of that conversation was not a weapon. It was an engineering philosophy, and it was baked over the following decade into everything humanity built in space. The mining rigs beyond Neptune had hulls rated for impact loads that no asteroid field required. The orbital weather platforms had power coupling systems that drew 40 times the energy needed for atmospheric observation. The research stations had communication arrays with a directionality that had no scientific function. And 17 of the launch vehicles commissioned between 2042 and 2051 carried, beneath their publicly filed cargo manifests, payload bays that had been quietly described in certain documents as flexible use. I had known about this. Not all of it, but enough. And the reason I had never found it frightening was the same reason the baker in Geneva had been selling bread this morning. Humans do not prepare for the worst because they expect to lose. They prepare for the worst because they refuse to. When the conquered fleet formed its line and went silent, waiting for what it clearly expected would be a rapid capitulation, what it did not know was that every flexible use platform in our solar system was already active, already coordinating, already doing the thing that humans are almost uniquely capable of doing under pressure. Adapting faster than the situation expects. I watched the tactical display in the lower chamber as the first readings came back from the outer platforms. The conquered ships were enormous. They were sophisticated. They were crewed, presumably, by beings who had managed the surrender of 41 civilizations and had every reason to believe they knew exactly how this went. What they did not know, because 41 surrenders had given them no reason to learn it, was how to engage an opponent that had no center. They expected a capital to threaten. We had dozens of capitals, each one of which had, in the hours since the first broadcast, quietly activated its own independent response chain. They expected a military command to neutralize. Our command was distributed across 17 orbital nodes, none of which could disable the others, each of which could act alone. They expected a population to frighten into pressure on its leaders. And our population was, at that exact moment, watching this unfold on every screen in the world with an expression that I can only describe as focused. Not the focus of fear. The focus of people who have decided. The first exchange happened at Mars orbit. One of the 11 ships that had moved into the inner system came within range of what the public registry listed as a mineral survey drone cluster, and the cluster did not behave like mineral survey drones. I will not describe the exchange in detail, because detail is not the point. The point is duration. 6 hours and 14 minutes. That was how long it lasted from the first moment of contact to the moment the conquered fleet's inner system line broke, and the ships pulled back beyond the orbit of Jupiter. We lost people. I want to say that plainly because it matters. 3 platforms were destroyed completely. 1 was disabled and later recovered. The names of the people on those platforms were read aloud in the chamber when it was over, and the room was quiet for all of them. War, even a war fought in the cold silence of space, is paid for in names. But the conquered fleet retreated. 25 ships, representing the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy, withdrew from engagement with a civilization that, by their own classification system, should have surrendered after the first broadcast. I sat in the chamber and watched the tactical display update, and I thought about the number 41, and then I thought about the number 0 and the difference between them. Then Veth-Saron called again. This time the voice was very different. "Representative Voss," it said, and for the first time it sounded like something that had not prepared for this call. "I would like to speak with you privately." "All right," I said. "I have one question." "Ask it." The pause was not calculated this time. It was genuine. "What are you people?" I looked at the screen for a moment. Then I said, "Give me a few hours. I will try to explain." I took 4 hours before I called Veth-Saron back, and I used every minute of them. I talked to the Security Council. I talked to Patrick Cole. I talked to 3 linguists and 2 historians and a behavioral scientist who specialized in interspecies communication theory and had spent her career hoping someone would eventually need her. I wrote nothing down. I just listened, and I thought, and I tried to find the shape of something that most humans understood instinctively, but almost none of us had ever been asked to explain to someone who had never seen it before. When I finally sat down at the console and opened the private channel to Veth-Saron's ship, I did not have a speech prepared. I had something better. I had clarity. Veth-Saron appeared on screen looking, in whatever way a being with gray shifting skin and widely spaced eyes could look tired. "Representative Voss," it said. "Veth-Saron," I said, "you asked what we are. I would like to answer that, but first I want to ask you something." A short pause. "Proceed." "In your 41 transitions, how many of those civilizations had survived a near-extinction event before you arrived?" The pause this time had a different quality. Not surprise exactly. More like the particular stillness of someone who has just understood the shape of a conversation they did not expect to be having. "Several," it said carefully. "How many of them had survived more than one?" A longer pause. "2," it said. "And those 2," I said, "did they surrender quickly or slowly?" "Slowly," it said, and then after a moment, "But they surrendered." They probably thought they had no other choice, I said. Most people, when they look at something much larger than themselves, make a calculation. They measure what they have against what they are facing, and they decide whether the cost of resistance is worth it. That is rational. That is reasonable. It is, in fact, the correct decision by almost every model of risk assessment ever developed. And yet, Vethsaran said, and I noted that it was completing my thought rather than waiting for me. And yet, I agreed. The problem with that model when applied to humanity is that it assumes the calculation is the only thing driving the decision. It assumes that the deciding factor is survival probability. And for us, for many of us, it is not. Vethsaran was quiet for a moment, not the careful quiet of a trained diplomat managing a reaction, the genuine quiet of something listening. There is a story from our history, I said, that I want to tell you. It is not a great story. It is not a proud one in any clean sense. About 1,000 years ago, a relatively small group of people on our planet was cornered by a much larger force. They had no realistic chance of winning. Their advisors told them to negotiate surrender. Their allies had already pulled back. Every reasonable analysis of the situation pointed to the same conclusion, which was that holding out would cost them everything. They held out, Vethsaran said. They held out, I said, not because they thought they would win. At least, most of them knew they probably would not. They held out because there is something inside the human emotional structure that responds to the prospect of being forced into submission not with fear, but with a specific kind of energy that we do not have a single clean word for. The closest terms in English are defiance, or stubbornness, or will. But none of them fully capture it, because they all imply a kind of anger, and it is not always anger. Sometimes it is just a very quiet certainty that some things matter more than the calculation. That seems, Vethsaran said slowly, inefficient. I laughed. I could not help it. It was a genuine laugh, and Vethsaran went very still on screen in what I was beginning to recognize as its version of surprise. It is spectacularly inefficient, I said. We are aware of that. We have written extensively about it. We have had wars specifically about whether that quality is a virtue or a pathology. Some of the most brilliant minds our species has ever produced have argued, with considerable evidence, that it has caused more suffering than any other single trait we carry. And yet you keep it, Vethsaran said. We cannot get rid of it, I said. We have tried. Not literally, but culturally, philosophically, politically. Every few generations someone proposes a version of humanity that has rationalized that instinct away, that has built systems clean enough to make it unnecessary. And every time something happens, some event large enough to make the calculation irrelevant, and there it is again. I leaned forward slightly. Your conquered has been watching us for 114 years, Vethsaran. You have seen 2 world wars. You have seen a plague that crossed the entire planet and reached into every community on every continent. You have seen fires and floods and collapses of systems that should have been stable. You have seen us come to the edge of ending ourselves more times than I care to count. Yes, it said quietly. And what did we do every time? It looked at me. Its eyes were hard to read, but I was getting better at it. You rebuilt, it said. We rebuilt, I said. Sometimes badly. Sometimes in ways that created new problems. Sometimes with a great deal of pointless suffering that better decisions would have avoided. But we rebuilt. We have never, not once in our entire recorded history, reached a point from which we did not eventually come back. Not because we are more powerful than the things that have come against us, but because we do not accept that a situation is permanent simply because it is very bad. Vethsaran was quiet for a long time. Outside the window of its ship, if it had a window, the darkness of space was the same darkness that surrounded Earth, that surrounded every world in every system that had ever sent a signal or received one. The conquered, it said finally, was built for a specific purpose. There are regions of this galaxy where uncontrolled development of certain technologies by certain types of civilizations has resulted in outcomes that I do not have sufficient time to describe fully. The Concord exists because 47 species looked at what had happened in those regions and decided that some mechanism of coordination was necessary. We are not conquerors, Representative Voss. We are, in our own estimation, a safeguard. I understand that, I said, and I meant it. I am not arguing that the conquered is malicious. I do not think you are. I think you have done what you believed was necessary, for reasons that had genuine logic behind them. I think 41 civilizations agreed with that logic, and some of them probably genuinely flourished under your administration. They did, Vethsaron said. The outcomes have been in aggregate positive. But those civilizations made a choice, I said. They decided through whatever internal process they had that the cost of resistance exceeded the value of self-determination. That is a legitimate choice. It is a dignified choice. It is not our choice. Vethsaron was looking at me with an expression I was only just beginning to name. It was not hostility. It was not contempt. It was something much more interesting. It was the look of something that had just understood, for the first time, that it was in a conversation it had never prepared for. Representative Voss, it said, if the conquered cannot contain you, and I am now prepared to formally accept that it cannot, not without a cost that the conquered's member species would not authorize, then we are required to ask a different question. Yes, I said. What do you want? The 4 hours of preparation collapsed into a single sentence. A seat at the table, I said, not under it. Vethsaron went still. That would be unprecedented, it said. So is refusing you, I said. A long pause, the longest yet. I will, Vethsaron said finally, bring this to the full council. I want you to understand, Representative Voss, that the process will not be simple. There are member species who will resist. There are legitimate concerns about integration, about safety, about the structural implications of adding a civilization that has never operated within the conquered's framework. I know, I said, but you are going to bring it to them. It was not a question. Vethsaron looked at me for one more moment. Yes, it said, I am going to bring it to them. The screen went dark, and I sat for a moment in the quiet, and then I called Patrick Cole and told him we were going to need to pack for a longer trip than originally planned. The ship they sent for us was not the same model as the warships. It was smaller, more elegant, built for something other than intimidation, with long curved lines and interiors that were clearly designed to accommodate multiple species without fully suiting any of them. I was told it was called a diplomatic transit vessel, and that it was one of 12 in the Conquered's fleet. The other 11 were currently being used to facilitate transitions, which meant ours was the only one currently in use for something else entirely. There were 6 of us on the human side. Me, Patrick Cole, a theoretical physicist named Diana Lowe who had spent 20 years studying the signal anomalies and had more context for alien technology than anyone else alive. An admiral named George Burroughs who had overseen the orbital response, and who I brought not because I expected violence, but because I wanted the conquered to see the face of the person who had directed it. A linguist named Clara Mead who had worked alongside me on the communication protocols, and a young climate engineer named Oliver Penn who had never been outside Earth's atmosphere before, and who I brought specifically because he reminded me of that baker in Geneva, going about his work with complete steadiness in the middle of everything. The journey took 4 days by their faster-than-light equivalent, which translated to about 90 minutes of subjective travel time after the initial transition. I spent most of it reading everything Diana could tell me about the Conquered structure, its history, its politics. I slept 4 hours. I ate twice. I looked out the viewport when my mind needed a rest from language. The station was larger than anything I had a good reference point for. It orbited nothing, suspended at the gravitational midpoint of a system 300 light-years from Earth, a position chosen specifically because it was equidistant from the nearest 11 member worlds. It had been built over centuries, extended and modified as new species joined, and the result was something that looked less like a constructed object and more like a city that had grown without a plan, which in many ways was exactly what it was. Our arrival docking bay was designated neutral, which meant it had been configured for no specific species, which in practice meant it was a little uncomfortable for everyone. I appreciated the honesty of that. Vethsaron met us at the dock personally, which Diana told me was unusual and significant. It was flanked by 2 others of its species, and 3 beings of a kind none of us had seen before, tall and slow-moving with broad faces and eyes that tracked independently of each other, who were identified as representatives of the Concord's mediation corps. Representative Voss, Vethsaron said, and its voice without the translation filter had a resonance that I felt more than heard. Vethsaron, I said, thank you for the invitation. It was not entirely, it said, an invitation in the traditional sense. No, I agreed, but I appreciate it regardless. The walk to the council chamber took 20 minutes through corridors that opened onto views of the station's interior, vast connected spaces where dozens of species moved and worked, and conducted the ordinary business of governance on a scale that made the unbuilding in Geneva look like a neighborhood office. I watched it all without letting my face show what I was feeling, which was something between wonder and a sharp, specific resolve. I had been in rooms designed to make people feel small before. I recognized the technique. Rooms built tall, tables built wide, chairs calibrated to sit slightly lower than the ones across from them. The architecture of power. The Concord had been doing this for a very long time, and they were very good at it. But I had also, 3 days ago, watched humanity hold its line against 25 ships, and somewhere in the weight of that fact, I had found something that none of this architecture could reach. The chamber held representations of 31 of the 47-member civilizations. The others attended through relay screens, some in real time, some on delay due to distance. The seats formed a wide ellipse with an open central space, and in that central space was a standing position that was, by design, slightly lower than all the surrounding seats. I noted that. I walked to it anyway. The opening arguments from the member delegations were, in several cases, hostile. Not violently so, but clearly. A delegate from a species called the Voran, whose member world had joined the Concord after a long and complicated transition of its own, spoke at length about the dangers of admitting a civilization that had demonstrated both advanced weapons capability and what it described as structural unpredictability. A representative from the Theron Assembly argued that Earth's Class 7 classification had been issued for documented reasons, and that a single engagement, however unexpected, did not erase the underlying risk assessment. I listened to all of it without interrupting, and I did not take notes because I did not need to. I had spent 36 years listening to rooms tell me why something could not be done. When it was my turn to speak, I stood in the lowered central position, and I looked around the ellipse at 31 species and the relay screens of 16 more, and I thought briefly, with a very specific private warmth, about my mother. The most important thing, she had said, is to remember that the other side is also afraid of something. I am not going to argue that humanity is not dangerous, I said, and I watched the room still slightly at the directness of it. You have the data. The Class 7 assessment was made on the basis of real information. We have a history of conflict. We have developed technologies that can be used for harm. We have made decisions, collectively and individually, that a reasonable observer would call reckless. I paused. What I am going to argue is that dangerous and destructive are not the same word, and that the question you should be asking is not whether Earth is safe, but whether Earth is useful. I let that sit for a moment. The Concord has been in existence for over 400 of our years. In that time, you have brought stability to 41 civilizations, preserved biological and cultural diversity across a significant portion of this galaxy, and built a framework of cooperation that has, by any measure, prevented outcomes that would otherwise have been catastrophic. That is a real achievement. I am not here to dismiss it. I looked at the Voran delegate. But there are 3 problems that this council has been working on for longer than Earth has had written language. I have read your records, as much of them as were available to me. The boundary erosion in the outer reaches, the signal degradation affecting long-range communication across the Meridian cluster, and the biological collapse affecting 4 member worlds in the southern arm, which your medical corps has been addressing for 200 years without a resolution. The room was very quiet. I am not claiming that humanity can solve problems that 47 civilizations and 400 years have not. I am saying that the approach required to solve them is one that this council, by its own internal structure, is not designed to take. It requires a willingness to try things that have a significant chance of failure. It requires the kind of thinking that throws out the existing model when the existing model is not working, even if discarding it is uncomfortable. It requires, and I will use the most honest word I have for it, a certain useful stubbornness. I looked around the room. You classified us as a developmental risk because of our unpredictability. I am standing here asking you to consider whether, for certain specific problems, unpredictability is exactly what you need. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then the Theron representative said, slowly, "You are asking us to invite chaos into an institution built specifically to manage it." "No," I said. "I am asking you to invite a partner, one who has different tools, one who does not always use them gracefully but uses them fully and does not stop using them when the situation gets difficult." The vote that followed was not fast. It took 4 hours of closed deliberation, and during those hours the 6 of us sat in a waiting room designed for no specific species, which meant the chairs were slightly wrong for all of us. And Diana and Clara talked quietly about acoustic resonance in alien architecture, and George Burroughs looked at the ceiling, and Oliver Penn found a window and stood at it in exactly the way he had stood at the viewport on the ship, still and clear-eyed, watching a galaxy he had never seen from the outside before. I sat and thought about the baker in Geneva, who had sold bread the morning the world changed. When Vethsaron came to the door, I read the answer in its posture before it spoke. Not triumph, not relief, something more complicated than either. "The vote has passed," it said. 24 in favor, 20 opposed, 3 abstentions. Earth is offered associate membership in the Galactic Concord, pending the completion of a formal integration framework. 24, Patrick Cole said beside me quietly. "Barely." "Barely is enough," I said. Vethsaron looked at me with its widely spaced eyes. "Representative Voss," it said, "I want you to understand the weight of what has been agreed to today. This institution has rules, procedures, histories. There will be resistance, internal and external. The integration process will not be simple. There will be moments when your people are asked to operate within constraints that feel, by your nature, deeply uncomfortable." "I know," I said. "There will be moments," it continued, "when the Council makes decisions that humanity disagrees with, and the mechanisms for that disagreement are slow and formal and will test your patience considerably." "I know that too," I said. "And you still want this." I looked at it. "We want the stars," I said simply. "We have wanted them since before we had the word for wanting. Everything else is just the work of getting there." Vethsaron was quiet for a moment. Then it said, "There is a great deal of work to begin." It led us back through the long corridors of the station, past the wide interior spaces where dozens of species moved in the ordinary business of a galaxy, and I walked behind it with the 5 people I had brought with me from a world that was, 3 days ago, facing the end of its independence, and was now facing something considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. Near the end of the corridor, before we reached the formal signing chamber where the preliminary documents were waiting, there was a wide viewport. I stopped at it for a moment because I could not help it. The galaxy from here was nothing like it looked from Earth. From Earth it was a smear of light across a dark sky, beautiful but abstract, a painting of a thing rather than the thing itself. From here, 300 light-years out, it was depth and distance and structure, the far arm curving away in a sweep of stars so dense they blurred at the edges, the dark lanes between them as real and textured as anything solid. The young conquered aide who had been trailing quietly behind our group stepped up beside me. "Is it strange?" the aide said, its translator giving it a voice that was lighter and less certain than Veth-Saron's, seeing it from here for the first time. I looked at the galaxy for a moment. "Terrifying," I said. The aide was quiet for a second. "Then why do you want to go?" I turned from the viewport and looked down the corridor to where the others were waiting, to the chamber beyond them where a document was sitting on a table that would begin a process none of us fully understood, that would ask things of humanity we had not yet imagined, that would take lifetimes to complete, and would not be without cost or pain or the specific grinding difficulty of doing something genuinely new. I thought about 41 civilizations that had looked at the ships in their sky and made their calculation. I thought about the baker in Geneva. I thought about my mother. Terrified, I said, "Let's go anyway." And I walked to the chamber, and the work began.